Titanfall 2, a game that came out like 3-4 years ago, back in 2016, 2017. I can't remember. And if I can remember, this game sold incredibly poorly. It went down to 1/5 its price in the span of a year when it first came out. That was sad. But I guess you can't help it. Shit happens. Game was great, honestly, for a first-person shooter. Compared to something like COD during its time, it was actually pretty far. It was ahead of its time. Can even say it's ahead of its time right now. Genuinely underrated gem, but don't bother even downloading it for the multiplayer. Community's dead for sure. You'd wait for maybe 10 minutes for a single game, and once you were done with that, you probably wait another 10 minutes for another game with the exact same people. There was a pretty big guarantee for that. The multiplayer was very well done, honestly. Weapons, game modes and all. Weapons specifically, the sound design was amazing. You could just tell one gun from the other just from how it sounded. An alternator sounded completely different from a car submachine gun. A flatline sounded completely different from an R301. And it works for it isn't just for aesthetic, because it serves a purpose in game. If you remember the sound of a specific weapon, you know what kind of combat you know what kind of firefight you're getting into. You know how long they can keep firing without reloading. You know how much damage they can do. You know how fast they can kill. You know how accurate they can be at what range, and that helps you evaluate your lets you put more thought into playing the actual game, and makes it intuitive. It makes it feel like you're actually putting in effort to play an FPS. I know that sounds bizarre to some. It's not just gunning and gunning and gunning. You have to put some level of thought into it. The energy weapons especially, you could hear the crisp burn of the L-Star when the projectiles just flying through the air. As for the visual design of the weapons, actually pretty well done as well. Despite the energy weapons being far more futuristic than the conventional ballistic ones, they all still kind of have a very similar aesthetic. You can tell they're definitely made for the same universe. The pilots as well, visually, although the differences between classes were there, you could still tell there was a cohesive aesthetic between all of them. They looked like they came out of a factory line, which they did, because Hammond Robotics and whatnot. And their design actually followed the same philosophy as the sound design, in that you could tell the differences just by looking at them, and that helped you evaluate what you were getting into with a fight. You could tell that a stim pilot from a data knife pilot, you know what kind of ability they're gonna pull if they're in a sticky situation. Especially those stim pilots, my god, that shit was annoying. They just get low health and fucking sonic their ass out of there. Then you would try to chase them down, and that never turns out well. Personally, I loved all the classes except for AWOL. It just didn't fit into the design philosophy of Titanfall as a game, because of how much the combat system worked around parkouring, constantly moving, and that ability just contradicted all of that, because the whole point of the AWOL was to anchor down. That didn't make sense, because you're supposed to always be on the move. That's the whole point. Not that the A wall isn't fun. It definitely is, but it didn't work in terms of the design philosophy. At least from my opinion. Titans fit well as Titans suffered from the same effect, not the A wall, but the good sound and visual design, distinction and contrast. Every Titan looks so distinctively different from one another. And again, you just know what you're getting yourself into with each fight. I'm not going to fight a Scorch the same way I'm going to fight an Ion. Well, except for the Tripwire. Tripwire works a similar way with Scorch's traps. But small overlaps, that's fine. I love the close range. I love the close range Titans because they were just so much more intense to play. It felt a lot more competitive. Ronin players were definitely more on the try-hard spectrum of the player base. That kind of just went without saying. The fact that Ronin is a samurai-based Titan kind of just fed into that. They're kind of super edgy neckbeards who had samurai swords hanging on their mantle or whatever. At least that was the stereotype. Movement felt great to play in this game. Parkour was amazing. Definitely better done than any other game I've played. Bunny hopping was great, although most people say it was try hardy, despite the fact that it actually takes very little effort. But I guess that's my 2 cents. What else? Yeah, grapple definitely should have been a basic tool for every pilot, for every class. It shouldn't have been a class. It should just be a core mechanic, because it complemented the whole movement system of Titanfall. You would get the grapple with a class ability, is what I'm saying. It made more sense to do that. For the game modes, they were mostly very well done. They fit with the parkour system and the Titan system and the pilot system very well. Game modes like Bounty Hunt, Capture the Flag to some extent, and Amped Hardpoint. Yeah, Amped Hardpoint fit very well into the Titan and pilot dynamic, especially B Point. B Point was always open to contest for Titans and pilots. That was great. That worked great. To my not, at least for, I can't really think of anything to complain about the multiplayer. I love that every map. Angel City is a classic, honestly. The Coliseum map could have used some work. I get it's supposed to be one-on-one, and nothing else should interfere into the fight, but a bit more obstacles would be nice. As for single player was very well done. I love the level designs. They told the story through the game mechanics very well in a way that's not actually seen in most single player games. Especially levels like Ash's Factory, where you just had to keep jumping from platform to platform. You were always on the edge. And of course, there's the all famous IMC facility where you just had to keep jumping from past to present, and that told the story so well while you were parkouring. So your mind was just always on the edge, on your own actions and everything that was just going on around you. That was a great way to tell the story, honestly, in very quick, condensed bits, while the player's trying to focus. It really was very engaging. Like, even sitting right now, I could still remember the feeling of playing that level. Definitely some of the best levels in any game, not just first-person shooters. As for the story, it was clean, it was simple, it was basic. It didn't need to be any more than what it was because it's a story. It just needed to be told. It didn't have to be incredibly complex. It didn't need it to be. It didn't need to be. It didn't have to have incredibly in-depth themes, really dark themes, or anything like that. It just had to tell a story, and that was it. And it did that. That was the bare minimum. It just had to do that, honestly. Especially for an FPS where certain games would go over the top to tell PTSD stories, which is just, and then completely flop. Either because the developers don't have a good baseline to work on PTSD or frame of reference. But yeah, the story works great in that it's just simple. That was it. It didn't try to be anything than what it needed to be. As for the dynamic between BT and Cooper, again, it was well done. It was simple, and it was everything that was necessary and nothing more. There was no incredibly complicated bond between man and machine. No, it was just two consciousness, so to speak, that grew an attachment with what they were doing because they had the same objectives, the same goal, the same motivation. So they grew a bond. That was clean. That was simple. A bit cliche because you could just tell either both of them were gonna die, or BT was gonna die. BT was guaranteed to die, regardless whether or not Cooper was going to. But I digress. It was cliche, but it was good because it was simple and it was well done. Nothing over the top, nothing that just screamed trying too hard. It was what it was needed to be, and that was all that it had to be. Honestly, this game did not get as much credit as it should have from mainstream media, even from the community when there was a viable community presence. Everybody could cohesively agree that this game was just so incredibly underrated by mainstream gaming media and the developers. Not the developers, the publishers, Electronic Arts, EA. It was completely ignored by EA. Barely saw any advertising for it. Barely pushed it. But at least, even if we don't get Titanfall 3, at least Apex Legends puts in some level of effort to pay homage to Titanfall 2, adding more onto the lore in terms of the companies and creating more not to say character, but adding more human elements into the world of Titanfall. Adding more personality, so to speak. But if we do ever get a Titanfall 3, honestly, all it just had to do is not get thrown to the side like what happened to Titanfall 2. It could be a copy paste, and as long as it wasn't just thrown into the bin, that would be great. It just had to be noticed. It didn't have to be unique. It didn't have to have some 800 new classes of titans and pilots. It could be completely copy pasted. Nobody would care, as long as it actually got noticed. Honestly, that's all I have to say for this game. I loved it. I felt it's underrated. It deserves recognition that it didn't get from everyone except for the people who actually played it, like me. And I hope more games come out like this. Fun, intuitive, simple, not trying too hard, not doing what it doesn't need to. Not that that's a bad thing, but good execution, bad execution, and whatnot. nothing's wrong with keeping this simple. Nothing's wrong with just sticking to the basics of a story, of a gameplay framework, whatever you want to call it.